I'm going to close there, and we're going to move straight on to the excellent panel. I think one of the members is just going to come up. So I've got Kate Platonova from HSBC, Debbie Lawrence from the London Stock Exchange Group, Sherry Madera from Mastercard, and Nicola Watkins from TheCityUK. I'm going to move over and sit down and allow them to introduce themselves briefly before throwing a couple of questions their way.
On?
Yes, let's start on, let's say the far left, that's not what I meant, but just the left.
Well, let's see. So I'm Kate Platonova. I work for HSBC, and I am Chief Data and Analytics Officer for the entire HSBC group. Definitely interested in the free flow of data, and this morning I was very interested in the free flow of traffic in the City of London. But
Hi, I'm Sherry Madera. I'm SVP of Public Policy at Mastercard.
I'm Debbie Lawrence. I head up the data management and strategy function for the London Stock Exchange Group. I joined as part of the Refinitiv acquisition 18 months ago, so I'm going to be talking mainly from the data vending space today.
And Nicola Watkinson, I'm the Managing Director of the international team at TheCityUK, and we've been working very closely with the ecosystem and across Whitehall to help to bring to bear a commercial understanding of how data is moved, used and stored to help inform government policy.
Thank you so much, and it's great to have such a wonderful panel. I'm really hoping to draw out some of the sort of practical challenges, difficulties, opportunities facing firms and financial firms operating cross-border in respect of data. Nicola, I thought I could start with you and ask, what from your perspective, what does digital trade mean for FPS firms and how they use it?
I think it's a really good question, because if you look at the news and what we see around the place over the last few years, we've seen so much publicity about what's been happening with physical supply chains and all the problems that's been experienced with the pandemic and then with the recent Russian war. But we haven't really stopped to understand that digital supply chains are under just as much stress. Mainly because it's perhaps invisible, or we might ask ourselves, is it because it doesn't really matter? And I think in that sense, that's the point that I really want to step back before we dive in and say it really does matter. And why does it matter? Because if you think just about this industry, about financial and professional services, we absolutely rely on the digital supply chain, whether it's to evaluate new investment opportunities, whether it's to deal with financial crime, with preserving cybersecurity risks, with regulatory reporting, with helping to develop new products and services for customers or provide follow the sun customer support. So we are really dependent on these global supply chains that are digital. And the reality is, as you put up on your slide, that the amount of protectionism has doubled since 2017. And that should cause us all real concern, because it does have a huge economic impact. If you think about this industry, again, it's about 12% of economic output. It employs 1 in 14 people here in the UK. 50% of the exports, and I think, we know that it's a huge trade surplus that we bring. It's about 90 billion if you put the financial and professional services together. 50% of those exports are outside of London, so it has a huge regional impact as well. And if we're going to keep those exports flowing and growing and make the UK a genuine leading international financial centre, then we have to really be focused on what we're going to do around preserving the free flow of data. I think it's, one of those things that tends to get a little bit underdone. And to be a trusted hub for data is one of the things that we have put in our international strategy, as we think it's absolutely fundamental, not just for this industry, but for more widely. As we heard earlier today, it's not just about our industry, but any small business needs to have cross-border payments these days. And so it's, these are reasons why I think we should be paying a lot more attention to it.
Yeah, thank you. And Kate, I was wondering, and you can sort of answer the first question as well, but I'd be really interested in knowing what the key issues faced by you at HSBC are, and sort of how you go about overcoming them and the like.
Well, we have seen the same sort of shift in regulatory landscape, and data that used to flow freely is now flowing with much more difficulty. To add to the first point, it's very interesting to so physical supply chain is something that we can all imagine, and as we're imagining the physical goods crossing borders, we should also imagine all the metadata, all the information that accompanies those goods that has to travel across those same borders and be consumed potentially in completely different countries. And that's why it is a super, super important point to emphasize that everything we do now, bills of landing, and so on and so forth, is digitizing very, very rapidly. So when we talk about, well, how do we operate in this environment? There are two considerations that a bank like HSBC always has. First of all, how does it impact our customers? That's one of the most important things we must think about. And then secondly, how does it impact us as a company? So to set some context, we operate in 64 different markets. And in those 64 markets, we offer products and services to global customers. And in order to do that, one needs to set up either a local subsidiary or a branch. And that's where you get hit with the local regulations. So it's not necessarily the free trade agreements across borders, but you're subject to all the tax regulation and everything that happens in that country. So to sort of then go from there, and what do we need to consider sort of issues and problems that arise? The main topics for us is obviously the regulatory provisioning for the flow of data across jurisdictions that can either help us mitigate our operational and compliance risks, or it might hinder. So that's where that patchwork of regulation has to be very well thought out about what's allowable in one jurisdiction and how does it impact something else. And also, sort of when that regulation gets created, I would strongly encourage involving engineers who actually understand how on the platform level data works and flows and gets stored, because on occasion you see a bit of a disconnect between the letter of the law and how you actually must comply with it. So getting kind of tech folks involved would be great. And also the cross-regulatory collaboration is something that's very important to us. So the regulators need to align on their views and see how they can enable businesses like ours.
Wonderful. Sorry, Debbie, I was wondering if you could sort of bring in your experience, which I suppose is slightly different, but I'm sure you share many of the same.
Yeah, thank you. And I echo what Kate was saying, and obviously we're on the other side of the coin in terms of the data provision to the financial services. And I'm going to go slightly off piste from some of my prepared notes, because challenges around fragmentation and data localization have all been covered by the previous speakers. But I think, and it was interesting, the question from the gentleman on the floor about the need for multilateral conversations versus bilateral, because for global firms, bilateral doesn't always help, because we're having to deal with so many different bilateral arrangements. And whilst we might be a UK company, we deal with a global footprint. We distribute on a given day 300 billion messages around our network into 190 countries to our clients in those markets. They depend on that data in a timely fashion in order to power their risk services, their portfolio investments, etc. And I think any restriction around that free flow of data will have a direct impact on the financial services, not only from a cost standpoint, because naturally our costs will go up as we have to manage all the varying different legislations, whether it's, you know, in the Western world or in the Asian markets. But equally, I think it will drive reduced transparency and actually possibly have a negative impact on things like crime, financial crime and green crime, if we can't, you know, provide that provision of data globally. And I'm going to go very specifically to the varying sanctions that were rolled out as part of the invasion of Ukraine. We were sitting in the hub of all of that. Not only do we have a sanctions data set, and we saw a 600% increase in sanctions over the 6-week period from the 24th of February. So the teams were working round the clock to try and ensure that we were meeting our SLAs. But we were equally having to deal with the sanctions on data provision that varied. The UK had certain sanctions that related to data coming out of Russia, and the US had very different sanctions. And Freshfields, who I think are here today, spent a lot of time with us trying to interpret the language of the sanctions. Now, if you expand that out to data legislation, the complexity in the interpretation is time consuming, and I don't think it actually builds for a level playing field at all.
Yeah, and Sherry, I mean, one of the things you sort of notice when sort of looking at different data localization requirements globally is that quite a lot of them in the financial service space do relate to payments. and I know this is something you've sort of been warring against for quite some time, but it'd be wonderful to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sam. And I love the fact that both Kate and Debbie have spoken before me, because it kind of puts it in context. And Mastercard is a payments technology global system. And you all kind of touch your wallets thinking, okay, I've got one of those potentially, or I hope you do anyway, in your wallets. But certainly Mastercard is a full payments suite. Here in the UK, for example, through our acquisition of VocalLink, actually we deliver a lot of paychecks, we deliver a lot of account-to-account payments. And why I think it's appropriate timing is that, you know, Debbie is representing sort of that incredible, immense amount of data that flows into the financial system. And in a payment scenario, it moves over to Kate's world, which is a critical partner for Mastercard in terms of being able to provide services, not only through card, but through various different payment systems. And then Mastercard sort of sits as one of the many different payment providers out there that are able to switch and complete that transaction. So we use Debbie's data, we use, you know, Kate's systems and various others, and we're able to put that transaction together. So when we're thinking about digital trade, I love the fact that, as Artasha, you started us off this morning reminding us that digital trade is an absolutely essential partner to payment for that trade. And that payment by its nature is increasingly digital. So Mastercard in our 2021 annual report listed 112 billion transactions that were completed. That's 25% increase. And of course, all of this, we've all experienced it personally, has been accelerated by the pandemic. You know, so much we pushed us online, so much pushed us also, if we were going to venture out with our masks, to deal with things contactlessly. And so all of that is not only a UK phenomenon, but obviously global. And actually, the transactions that we reported last year were up 32% cross-border. So 25% number of transactions, 32% increase in cross-border. So again, this is all stuff we know, but we're putting a little bit of quantification around it and thinking about how does that, you know, make a difference. Nikki, you were mentioning that SMEs are a big part of this. And of course, when we talk about digital trade, that's really accelerated what they can do. We did a report last year that 6 in 10 SMEs quoted that over 66% of their growth came from cross-border transactions, digital cross-border transactions. So I'm just putting this in context because as we go into sort of the detail of regulation and thinking about FTAs, we want to keep all of that intact. It is a global trend and the UK can't miss out on that. In fact, we should be thinking about how the UK can be best practice in terms of making sure all of that is supported going forward. And actually, you know, you think, okay, well, you know, there's the banks, there are the data companies, you know, shouldn't they be driving a lot of this regulatory policy and determining, you know, what's working and what's not? You know, I do want us to put a little bit of a message out there that actually the payment systems themselves really need looking at to make sure there are no unintended consequences. We're absolutely in line with some of the things that have been all said previously. You know, data localization harms the ability for fraud protection, illicit fund flows, making sure AML is adhered to, et cetera. And of course, we're an integral part of that system. But electronic payment systems, EPS, often is not included explicitly in FTAs. And that feels like it runs foul to what I was just saying, that actually the electronic payment systems are facilitating digital trade. So let's see how it is we can be even more creative, constructive, and proactive about getting a transparency around some of that. Zertasha sort of set us off really nicely this morning as well, thinking about contactless. And actually, it's a really, really good example of where policy comes into play. So it used to be that our maximum limit here in the UK was 30 to tap. And then the pandemic came and it's now 100 to tap. That took quite a bit of thinking, because what if we said it's 1,000 to tap? Everybody in this room would slightly go, wait a minute, what if I lost my card, and what if someone's going to walk up, and etc. So that really starts bringing to bear the fact that these decisions are multifaceted, because it needs to be able to link back to fraud protection, cybercrime, thinking about how the system's going to work. And that level of complexity is increased tenfold when you start adding other countries and cross-border. So again, that thinking about policy objectives and how it plays out, I think that the payments providers are not just a follow-on. We should be even more central as we go forward to make sure that we are pushing this in a way that's going to continue to uphold where we want to go, which is increased growth, increased transparency, but making sure that those protections are absolutely first and foremost in our minds.
It's interesting you said that electronic payment systems are largely not covered. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on why that might be, and what needs to happen to sort of bring them within scope, if you want them to be there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we talk about on soil protectionism, thinking about localization, absolutely data is something that is top of mind. But actually, a lot of payment systems are also being increasingly pushed into a domestic system. So international payment systems allow for international rules to be followed and transparency to be held. And obviously in HSBC or other banking systems, et cetera, they look at that sort of pervasively across their network. As soon as payment systems start becoming quite domestically moderated, that creates more problems in terms of understanding how things work. So why are they not in FTAs? I think this is just a lag, basically, in thinking about where policy may start being a little bit disintermediated, whereas before I think that there was less focus on perhaps creating walls around a domestic system. So
something for the government trade officials in the room to think about.
And really happy to share what we're thinking about, because I think that there's things are moving so quickly in this space.
And Kate, I was going to ask, about the role of FTAs, what do you think is good and what needs to be improved? But actually, I'm going to reframe the question slightly. What do you need? What do you need from government to make your job easier? And then we can sort of say, well, could that be folded into an FTA or not? But I think probably that is the key question.
And it's an excellent question. So I think we've been talking in the general, so I'll try to get more specific. And it's sort of twofold answer to that question, Sam, right? What do we need from the government, and what does the private sector needs to do as well? A little bit different. So I'd like to table that idea. So what do we need from government? And my background is software engineering, so I like precise codable rules that you can check. And I think what we need is for FTAs to include a number of provisions. So first of all, have it as a standard provision, and we applaud UK for leading the way here, but having data flow and payment system and all the ecosystem around it firmly included in all future FTAs. Secondly, is that establishment of regulatory collaboration, right? Strongly driving that and finding like-minded partners. We've seen some countries that, again, are sort of philosophically on the same page as UK, but driving that regulatory landscape that becomes smoother for companies to operate in and takes into account some of the things that we're already doing to comply, and that sort of counts as points. And then common standards. So driving more common standards, making regulation sort of appropriately prescriptive, I would say, without being too heavy-handed, but more precise, because every time there is a principle, as we heard already, it is difficult to interpret, and there's a lot of overhead that happens that then the costs get passed on to the customer. But then what should we do differently? I feel that sometimes as a private sector, we need to be a lot more clear about what is the advantage to the local community and the local policymakers. We're quite inwardly focused and sometimes talk about how we benefit the banks and how we would cut costs and so on and so forth, and how wonderful our life would be. But we're probably not as clear with the communities to say, actually, this is a great boon to the local economy. These are the statistics, these are the trends that we're seeing. Let's enable job creation, and let's make sure that we're uplifting various locales through that legislation.
Yeah,
I might just build on that, because I think that is a really important point, because, and it's also two-way in free trade agreements. We're sitting here talking about what are the benefits to the UK, but there's huge amount of benefits to the countries that we're partnering with as well. They also have SMEs, they also have micro businesses, they have women-led businesses, they have a lot of people who would really love to be able to be providing services. And in order to do that, they also need cross-border payment systems that work for them. They also need to be able to move data across. And I think if we really do believe in this, in the levelling up agenda, if we really do want to keep growing our SME bases in all our countries that we, not just here in the UK, but internationally, we also need to think about how these free trade agreements lean into that and also provide greater financial inclusion, greater, economic empowerment. So I think, it's a win-win for both sides. It's not just this one-way street where the UK gets something out of it, or the financial and professional services industry itself gets something out of it.
I was just wondering, from your sort of membership and dealing with international policy, do you have companies coming to you and sort of saying, I'm thinking more on the smaller side, saying, so what do we do, how do we get in there? What do we do about that? I can't work out what I'm meant to do with the data, or is it more just it's one thing, rather than being the focus, it's just one of many areas of confusion that has to be overcome?
No, I think it is something that's causing people a lot of confusion at the moment. It's just very hard to navigate your way through. And I think the other point to say is that, when we think about moving data, people tend to think about it as point to point. Oh, we need to move it from whatever, the US over to the UK. But the reality is it's more complex than that. Businesses need to move their data to a number of different points. And in the study that we did, we found they were moving it to different places to do different things with it. So you might need to move it to somewhere in, say, Poland or in Eastern Europe, because they've got fantastic multilingual data analytics skills. You might want to move it to India because they've got fantastic software engineering and you need some help with that. You might be offering follow the sun customer support, so you need to be able to support that in South Africa and the Philippines as you're trying to offer customer service. And of course, between major financial hubs, as Sherry was saying, you need to be able to move data between the US and the UK and Singapore and the UK, because you need capital markets data, the sort of things that Debbie's been talking about to be able to flow, as well as payment data and other things. So I think when you're a small business and you're trying to think about all of these different rules and regulations that you're being asked to comply with at the moment, whether you're a business sitting in India or a business sitting in the UK, you really do need to navigate through so much complexity, and that's just stymieing the opportunities for growth.
If I can, jump in. Debbie is absolutely the expert on this sort of stuff, so I'm sure that you'll correct me where I'm wrong here. But fostering innovation as well can be stymied by some of these data protection rules. As Mastercard, we're really proud of making sure that we're helping to foster the fintech community. I use that concept of the rails. So if we're keeping good hold of how it is those transactions are moving around, various different types of payment methods. Actually, we're trying to foster innovation. That doesn't just come from us internally being able to make sure that we're making good use of our data and our tools. It's also to help fintechs do that. And of course, the UK is a huge center for fintech. We would hope that we're doing more of that, but perhaps the appeal as well is that some of the data we're able to share with those fintechs are from our global network. And so there lies a bit of a problem.
Debbie, going to you, so please build on the comments before, but also I would like to hear from you an answer from you on the what do you need question.
There's so many things that I could build on here, but to answer that question specifically, it goes to Kate's point around as much standardization and consistency as possible, and where possible, language that allows us to interpret it in the same way. Because we all know that vague legal language allows some firms to interpret it in a certain way and others not. And I think, again, for global organizations, HSBC, LSEC, the competitive dynamic of the market will mean that, to use Zertash's point around cherry picking legislation, we want to make sure that we don't have to do that. And to build on your point about having to be quite conscious about the impact of data regulation on the global community. We have a huge footprint in India, in China, in South Africa, in the Philippines. And if their data localization rules start to give us cause for concern about where we are based, that will have a massive impact on that country. So keeping that in mind is important when we're discussing the flow of data, and ensuring that we have to enable the global data flow, not the constant sort of bilateral data flow, but consistency would be my ask around as much as possible. I realize it's probably an ask, a sort of shooting for the stars to say an international standard, but as much consistency and language around interpretation.
Sam, and if I may jump into Debbie's point, we're super passionate about it. Yes, simple language. So my team does both sides, right? We create some internal policy around data and what one can and cannot do within HSBC, but then we also get to implement it. And it's fascinating when you design something and write something and you think it's perfect, and then you go to actually implement it on the ground, and how much feedback and how much refinement you go through. So I think that's probably one of our call to arms is when policy is being constructed, when those trade agreements are being constructed, test drive them. Don't just stop at the writing of the policy, but take it further to make sure that they are truly enforceable, implementable, and make sense.
And pragmatic. And I think, just to add on it, I think we also have to understand what the intent of the data flow is, because I think that'll also lead to determining whether it's being used. We all want to protect the individual. We all want to ensure that we do the right thing with the data. So what is the intent of the data flow? And if we keep that in mind with some of the language of the legislation, that might help. And I think I agree with Kate, if we can test drive some of it from an implementation standpoint, because we can't keep up with technology at the moment. Cloud has massively changed where we store data. And that's, so do the data legislation laws apply to on-prem databases or cloud or both? So test driving some of it would be good as well.
I'm slightly worried that in the calls for simplification, clarity, consistency, that if were this to happen, that me and also lawyer friends in the room might be put out of work. But of course I agree. I wondered now if we could perhaps go to the audience. I believe there might be an online question, or if not, I will, because I can't actually see the screen, so there may well be one on there, but I'm very sorry, virtual attendees. I'm going to go to the audience first, if anyone would like to raise a question. No question. Oh, yeah, there's a lady right at the back. If you raise your hand higher so the microphone can find you. No. If we wait for the microphone, so our virtual guests can hear as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name's Alison Hook, and I represent a company called Hook Tangaza, which is active in trade and regulation, particularly with a legal sector focus, but we do work elsewhere as well. I wanted to make it's kind of more of a point than a question, on the value of free trade agreements. I think from our experience, there are two things that I would flag up. One, I think in the most recent emanation of FTAs, the most recent generation, you're starting to see the inclusion of language around the moratorium on e-commerce tariffs imported into that text. And I think that's hugely valuable in terms of the political signal it sends and the normalization of that, given the difficulty we have at the WTO on that question. The second thing is that we are doing quite a lot of work with organizations like the World Bank and ITC on preparing developing countries for FTAs. And the policy preparation around that, particularly in areas like this, where they're actually going over their suite of policies and seeing where there are gaps and saying, okay, we realize we need to fill these things in, are hugely valuable. So I think there are additional things that I think FTAs do bring to the table outside of the text themselves. Final point, really, which is just based on personal bitter experience, another cost of localization that we've discovered is that you may find that when you have to move for localization, the system on which you've built your particular thing isn't supported. So you have to build a whole new piece of kit. And I just wondered if anybody had any comments on any of those points.
Well, can I make a comment on the system? It's my bread and butter. I'll probably make a little bit of a controversial point. So absolutely, yes, some of the older systems are very, very difficult to kind of pull apart and unwind. But at the same time, as technology moves forward, we do need to sort of collectively look at how systems are engineered and engineer them in a way that makes it much easier to comply with regulations and be ready if you need to sort of sub-segment it. Now, everybody took a deep breath in the room because everybody just imagined the bill for what Kate suggested. But that's one of the sort of not so nice sticks to encourage better engineering practices and frankly, better data engineering and better understanding what data you have, what purposes did you acquire them for, do you have all the consents, should you process it in this country or that country? So I kind of welcome the understanding that comes with that painful experience, but you're absolutely right. For some of the legacy pieces, it is incredibly challenging and it's easier to just build a new system and forget the old.
So I do now have a question from the online audience. And if I could ask you all to answer this, but to answer quite succinctly, if able, if you could pick one priority for the UK government in its digital trade provisions within an FTA context, what would that be? And I'm just going to run along.
Oh, there's so many, but the one I'm going to pick, because I think it's one we haven't really thought as much about, is I would love us to be able to find a way in the, given the reality is we're probably not going to get an FTA with the US anytime soon, is to find another way in which to create the equivalent of some kind of a digital trade agreement with the US. It really is a golden corridor. And it's really important to both markets to be able to improve the collaboration we have on data and make sure that we embed that connectivity going forward.
Probably just to ensure that in every free trade agreement there is a provision for data, and as much as possible to prohibit the localization caveats that get put into those free trade agreements.
And I suppose what you don't want is what's in Australia, India, where there's a specific provision on data reasserting the ability of the Indian government to require payments data to be sold, to be localized. So good provision that's positive rather than
Exactly, yeah.
reaffirming bad practice. Sherry.
Well, I would say this, wouldn't I? But to make sure that sort of the payments piece of the puzzle is integral to the thinking around free trade agreements, so that the potential unintended consequences, and we haven't talked about the climate change and sustainability, but there is a direction of travel that starts saying that there is a carbon border adjustment mechanism coming up in the EU. How is that data being transferred effectively? How is that potentially going to be replicated over the coming decades as to what needs to go between different countries? So making sure that on the payments flow, we're looking at the future of where it is we're trying to go and include things that are going to protect us from falling foul because we want to do more trade.
Well, since Sherry nicked my ESG point and sustainability, no worries. Well, all good. So we do need that. I will go a slightly different direction. I think including financial regulators in the drafting of those particular clauses of agreements, and including financial services, folks from the industry, is very important. because that's what we see sometimes is the agreements are there, they include some clauses that actually quite go in odds with financial regulation, and then you have to get Sam involved to figure out how to be on the right side of the law in both cases.
I would certainly recommend doing that. So we've got 5 minutes left, and to bring this to a close, because we've been sort of talking about the challenges being faced now, how existing agreements can potentially help overcome them or not. But I thought I'd just end by asking each of you sort of what excites you, sort of, you know, looking into the future in this space. Is there anything particularly excites you that you're interested in, that you're just, you know, sort of monitoring, that you feel hasn't been picked up? This is really just an opportunity just to, that thing you've been thinking about that you've wanted to say, to articulate it. Yes.
I think there's a real potential for this concept, and you know, we've got pet passports, we all have own passports of a data passport. Kate talked about the metadata that 10 years ago was probably a data set that nobody really got particularly excited about. Nobody really, we certainly didn't, as a data vendor, we never thought about commercializing metadata. It was just something that we had. But actually, that metadata in a world of data regulation becomes critical. Who owns the data? What's the lineage? What can you do with it? And if we could find a way as an industry to build this concept of a data passport, I think that starts to solve some of the frustrations that the data flow might have to ensure compliance and regulate, you know, that we're upholding the letter of the law, but at the same time doing as much as possible with the data that we're allowed to do. So I'm quite excited about that idea. I'm saying it out loud in case anybody else from my company is here and they can jump on that idea and help me with it. But I can see a world of a data passport.
All right, I'll go next. Well, look no further. We've got data visa in HSBC. One of the systems does exactly that. Perhaps we can sell you guys some data back and do some trade here. What excites me is the advancements in blockchain. So especially for trade finance, it is super, super important to see how that unfolds and how it gets regulated and how we all get to understand the technology, the implications, and trust in that technology. But for HSBC specifically, for our trade finance business, blockchain is super exciting, and we're doing quite a lot in that space.
Yeah, I might just build on this and say, you know, I think the innovation piece is one of the most exciting areas. So being able to use this data in new ways and come up with new services and new products that can, you know, that can, I guess, liberate a whole range of new opportunities, really build out the fintech ecosystem here in the UK. It's one of the things that makes people want to come to the UK, and it makes it a really attractive international financial hub. So the more we can become, you know, the best common denominator global hub for data, that's the kind of thing that excites me, because not just will it solve a lot of problems that we're experiencing today, but it will help to solve a lot of problems for tomorrow. And also, I think then leaning out from the UK into other markets and picking up, I think it was Anne's point at the back, about really looking at how we can use free trade agreements to enable and support other markets by bringing the expertise of the city and of the UK to help with a lot of the global challenges that we have, whether it's in climate change or other areas.
Sherry.
Yeah, I think I'd pick out sort of that teaser that we've been dancing about, which is climate change and sustainability. My other hat is that I chair a group called the Future of Sustainable Data Alliance, which is global. And when you think back to COP26 and you think ahead to COP27, there's a huge amount of global commitment out there at the country level. And actually, if you think about trade, digital trade, if you can actually monitor through a system as to understanding what is the footprint of what it is you're also importing as well as exporting, I think that brings the world together again to be able to raise all the boats and make sure that you're actually not diverting perhaps some of the commitments that you're making onshore to being able to be, and you need to be part of a global system. So trying to get more data that's involved in what is actually happening in those transactions and passing that to those that really want to monitor it and measure it, perhaps it gives us another tool in order for us to be able to move forward on that.
Wonderful. And with thank you to my wonderful panel with Kate from HSBC, Debbie LSEG, Sherry Mastercard, and Nikki from the City UK. I'm going to bring this session to a close. Could you all give them a round of applause?